So this is the outline of my talk. Going to be a quick introduction, followed by things that are going to be in SVG2 because they are in CSS. Mostly, and there'll be a few other things mixed in there just in SVG2. And then I'll move on to the SVG2 things. Okay, the SVG specification is advancing quickly. Many important pieces are already in, and here are the links. There's a working draft, an editor's draft. And SVG2 will offer many new things to artists: auto-wrap text, mesh gradients, hatching, etc. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the structure of SVG2. SVG2 is being ripped apart. It's being ripped apart into a core, SVG core, plus modules that are shared with CSS. CSS looked at SVG and found, oh, God, SVG's got all these cool things for many years. Maybe we can use them in HTML. So a lot of things that are being taken from SVG and moved to CSS so they can be shared between SVG and HTML. This is a good thing. Modules shared with CSS are more likely to be quickly incorporated into browsers, like CSS3 colors. You can already actually use CSS3 colors in SVG in the browsers. But there's one problem is that SVG is not a priority of the browsers. I've had people tell me that from a couple of different browsers. So things get put into HTML, CSS first, and then maybe a little bit later they make it into SVG. 3D transforms has taken a while to get into SVG. So that's the good part, is that things are going to go, if they're in CSS, they'll eventually wind up in SVG. But CSS and HTML also, their interests dominate, which makes it harder for the SVG group to make changes by itself. And one example is image rendering. Right now, if you upscale or upscale a bitmap, SVG has no way of telling you that you want that to remain blocky or you want it to be smooth. And there are different cases where you want one or the other. And we can't just go in and change it because CSS has taken an interest in that property, image rendering. So that's the bad part about it. So here's the structure. You have SVG 1.1 going to SVG2 core, and plus all these CSS modules: animations, color, compositing, blending, exclusions, filter effects, fonts, masking, shapes, text declaration, transforms, and more. So let's start looking at some of these. Color. CSS color level 3 has already been added to the browsers. So, for example, the turquoise text, that's done right now. In here, I've specified that color using HSL. So that's already in. SVG2 will have some additions. It'll have some different color spaces that are not in CSS color level 3, plus some color correcting stuff that's not in color level 3. There's a new solid color element in SVG2. This is good for custom palettes. So you can locate all the color information in one place and then change it easily. Now, you can simulate that right now in SVG 1.1 by using one-stop gradients, which is kind of misusing gradients to do that. But it doesn't work because you can't do that for gradient stops themselves and flood fill. If you're using a filter, that doesn't work. So in SVG2, we'll have a solid color element, which will be able to localize the color information. There are some new fill and stroke properties: context fill paint, context stroke paint, and context color. And this is important. This is one of the biggest problems people have had with SVG, is that your marker, the arrowhead, doesn't automatically match the color of the stroke. With these new properties, you can do that. So I have a little example. Marker with a fill equals context stroke paint. And it won't be just in markers. You'll be able to use this for patterns, gradients, etc. So it'll be easy to get color to inherit or to match from around. Compositing and blending. SVG2 references compositing and blending level 1. All the Porter Duft compositing operators are there, except for they're not going to be available in SVG. See the next slide. There are lots of new blending modes. SVG right now just does simple alpha blending, or a painter's module. It just puts one color on top of another. If it's partly transparent, you see a little bit of what's underneath, but none of the fancier blending modes are available. Also, right now you can't, well, since there's only one mode, you don't need to style it, but this will all be stylable in CSS. SVG 1.1 has some filter modes that you can use for compositing over in top, out, XOR, or you can find your own arithmetic operation. There are some new ones that are going into CSS, but it turns out, after reading very carefully the spec, even though the spec had its origins in SVG, those are not going to be immediately available to SVG. They're for Canvas only, and I don't know why. I need to ask about that. And here are some examples of blending, some of the new blending modes. Okay, SVG 1.1, by using filters, you could get some other blending modes other than simply putting something on top of another. And by using filters, but now there are other ones that are going to be available, and they'll be available from CSS. And I kind of like this one. This is from the spec itself, where you just overlay text on top of some texture, and the text picks up the texture. That's quite nice. It'll be very easy to do. Filters. SVG2 references CSS filter effects 1, and that's almost exactly the same thing as SVG 1.1 filters. So here's an example where they just took something out of SVG and put it in CSS so it could be shared between the two groups. What they've added to make it easier for people to use, they've added a few filter shorthands: grayscale, sepia, saturate, hue rotate, etc. And there's a few examples of those here. And then there's going to be a new custom filter primitive defined via shaders. So you can make, like I guess the example is making a flag wave. I'm not going to talk much about that at all because I think that's something quite complicated, and you won't be able to do those things kind of by hand. Well, when I thought I had more time, I was going to talk about a proposed new filter primitive that could do screening. I'll just give you a quick example. You have the picture of Abraham Lincoln, and you want to have a stippling effect. Well, you can do that now, like Inkscape, you could do that, but you end up with 11,000 points. You can't put 11,000 points in your SVG file. But if you have this filter primitive, then you can just define in a few short lines this effect, and you can do some other things. Pointillism, that's 21,000 circles there, or you could do like cartography. You can, by just defining a gradient, you can have the gradient, the amount of a certain color, define the probability that a pattern icon or pattern is placed there. Okay, I won't talk about the details, I don't have time. Transforms. Another thing that's been taken out from SVG2 into CSS are transforms. And they've been expanded. First of all, you can now style the transforms. In SVG 1.1, they're an attribute. You can't style them, they're just there. We add 3D transforms. Rotation, translation, scaling, perspective. Now these started appearing in HTML, I don't know, a year or two ago, and now you can start seeing them in the browsers. The image on the right is actually using a 3D transform to produce in SVG. It only works in Firefox right now. In Chrome, you can rotate objects in 3D transforms, but you can't, at least I couldn't get a perspective to work. So that's appearing and they're starting to appear in the browsers. Oh, and I have to do my demo. This is done only with SVG and CSS animations. There's no JavaScript here. It only works right now like that in Firefox. In Chrome, if you try to do it, Chrome collapses all the planes down to one and rotates it. How do I go back?
Just try backspace. Backspace?
I just tried backspace, didn't work. I guess I have to exit full screen mode.
Maybe just click, maybe it's not in focus.
No, this is a separate file. I want to go back to the original one.
Just...
Okay, that worked. Okay, now I want to talk about text layout, because this is something I'm kind of excited about, and I've been working on the last few months on, is we want to base SVG text layout on CSS. And there are all these modules that we need to deal with. And these modules are still in a state of flux. It's kind of hard to do because they're, some are making changes quite frequently. They're arguing about little parts. But we want to base SVG2 text layout on CSS. And there's some good reasons for that. First of all, SVG 1.1 text layout is essentially the same as a single line of CSS text layout. So there's really no change by doing this. It's backwards compatible with SVG 1.1. But by doing this, we make the dependence on CSS more explicitly clear so that the browsers vendors know they don't have to re-implement the code for SVG. They can just use the same code text layout that you're using for HTML, CSS, and use it for SVG. And that opens up the possibility of auto-wrap text, something that people have wanted for a long time. It was in the SVG 1.2 standard, which was never adopted. And the way we're going to do it is in such a way that it's possible that you can wrap the text, but you can do it in such a way that it falls back gracefully to SVG 1.1 rendering. Now, there's some differences between laying out text in HTML and SVG. SVG does not have a natural content area that's provided in the box model, in CSS by the box model. Also, SVG does not have line breaking elements. Now, there are three types of text layout in SVG2. There's pre-formatted text, which is essentially SVG 1.1 text, plus the ability to have multiple lines. But you do that ahead of time. You decide where the line breaks are going to be. And then there's auto-wrap text. That's new. And then the text on the path is the same thing as in SVG 1.1. The layout steps. First of all, you lay out the text according to, this is pre-formatted text, according to CSS rules, assuming an infinitely wide content area. And then you apply the SVG attributes x, y, dx, dy, and r, which can shift things around or rotate the text. And then the text anchor properties applied. SVG has a text anchor, so you can anchor things in the middle of the line, or the end of the line, or beginning of the line. Now, what's new is multi-line text can be done by using the whitespace property with the values of preserve or preserve line. And I have an example of that for you. So you can see a line break in the code. The text, this multi-line text, line break is anchored in the middle, and you can see how it's rendered in the bottom, in the middle. Now this is not actually doing it right now, but if I had waited a week, it should work in Firefox 25. It's already in Firefox 25, which comes out next week. I'm not sure it's going to actually do the lining in the middle right. I haven't checked that. Now, auto-wrap text. If you provide a content area, the text will auto-wrap in it. There are two ways to define a content area. One is to specify a width. How wide do you want your content area to be? That is for horizontal text, or how high you want it to be for vertical text. Or you can set the shape inside property, which is something from CSS shapes, to define a region for your content area, either through a CSS basic shape or by referencing an SVG shape. And here's an example of using the width. This text wraps at 200 pixels. I've got a 200 pixel width set up there, width equal 200. And then it's basically an infinitely high content area. So you can just keep on adding text. Here's an example by using the CSS basic shape. Shape inside is equal to a rectangle, starting at 50, 10, 200 wide, 80 high. And it wraps inside that. And it follows all the CSS rules. Here's one where you provide, is actually exactly the same, except for now you're using an SVG shape, a rectangle, and you're referencing it. Here is one showing a circle, wrapping inside a circle, showing that you can add padding to the shape, and the text will be wrapped inside that area defined by the padding. And you can use a shape outside to exclude a region. And you can have a margin around that shape that you're using for exclusion, so you exclude a little bigger area. There's one unresolved issue, and that's how to flow text into more than one shape. the way I originally thought, I'm told by the CSS people, won't work because they've already decided to use that for something else. You just can't list multiple shapes. There's a whole CSS region spec, but the way it's set up is a little complicated to use, I think, for SVG. We'll have to see about that. Okay, so those were the things that dealt with CSS. Now I'm going to move to the SVG stuff that's in SVG2. SVG2 will have flexible paint order. In SVG 1.1, the stroke is always on the top, which is not so good if you want to just outline some text, because that distorts the shape of your text. So you'll be able to say the order, including markers. You can have the markers on top or the bottom. There's a new line join. Traditional graphic packages have the bevel, round, and miter line joins. Well, the miter line join doesn't look so good when you have curves at the end. So there's a new extrapolate line join, which is just basically taking the curvature at the end of the line and extending it until the points meet. That's already in the spec. Something that's being explored right now, something we really like to have is variable stroke width, but it actually turns out to be kind of complicated. Like, what do you do at a corner? You have 3 different line joins you have to handle at the corner, and if the sides of the stroke are no longer parallel, that can get complicated. So it's going to take a little bit of work to do, but we're thinking about that. There's a lot of desire for flexible stroke positioning. The stroke is inside the fill region or outside the fill region, but I'm not sure it's going to make it into SVG2. Markers. Here's something that's nice. Is marker cutouts. If you draw a line between 2 particular points, like in Inkscape, you could snap a line between 2 particular points to other shapes, and then you add an arrowhead to the end. Sure, you could have the arrowhead hit the end of the line, but then you have a little bit of that line sticking out, and that's not very nice. So this is already in the spec to have a clip out region that clips the path. So here I show you for an arrow how it works for an arrow, and also how it would work like on a map if you had like a subway stop marked on the map that you can expose. You can get rid of the line in the region of the marker and expose the background. What's currently in the spec are knockout shapes. I don't think those are flexible enough for what we want, so we need to talk about that. But that's something that's going to come. And somehow we're going to have marker cutouts. There'll also be marker placement, new ways of placing markers. Right now you can only place markers at the ends of the line segments. We'll have ways of placing them automatically in the middle of the line segment, and also we'll be able to place them at fixed distances in some kind of pattern along the line. That's already in the spec. Also in the spec recently is marker orientation. It's a new value for marker orientation, auto start reverse. Right now, you have to, if you have a line with 2 arrows, 2 markers, and you want them to automatically position themselves correctly, you have to have 2 copies of the marker in your SVG file. With auto start reverse, you just need 1, because it'll say, okay, I'm a start marker, and I need to flip myself 180 degrees. Also, we recently decided that we're going to have markers on shapes. So rectangles can have markers in the corners. If you have a rounded rectangle, you'll get 8 markers. And then we decided that circles and ellipses would have 4. Hatched fills. These have been added to SVG2. They're a very common way of shading things and technical drawings on maps. That you can simulate them in SVG 1.1 by patterns, but if a pattern is a tiling, and at the tile boundaries you often get artifacts. Also, SVG is not just used for the web. There are people that use it to drive engravers and plotters. And if you're going along and you have to have the pen go up and down and draw a stroke, go up and down, draw a stroke, you're going to get artifacts where those joins are. So we now have ability to define hatched fills where you can get continuous lines. And here's some examples. Here's an example of a line. You basically just specify the pitch, that is the distance between the lines, and the angle. And then you can do cross-hatching by doing it twice. with different rotations. SVG2 will allow you to have multiple fills on an object, on a rectangle or circle or something. You can stack them. So you can have a gradient underneath, and then you can have a hatching, or you can have multiple hatchings. There's an example of dashed lines. You can have two different hatch paths in your hatch with different parameters, different properties. So here one has a dash pattern. And you can have wiggles. And the wiggles can be made to automatically connect. If you know SVG path syntax, you know you have to start off with the move to. If you drop the move to, it'll automatically calculate where it should start, and it'll automatically connect the end of the path segment to the beginning of the next path segment to have a continuous line. Now, and this example here is also interesting because if you do this with a pattern, it's not so easy because the wiggles overlap. You have to, the overflow visible is not defined for patterns, so you can't just have one line. You actually have to take your rectangle, fill it with the main line, and then you have a little wiggle here. It comes in on this side, and a little bit on this side. It's not so simple. Well, now with hatched fills, it'll be simple. And then if you want disconnected parts, then you provide a move to at the beginning, and I'll do that. Now I'll talk about mesh gradients. Meshes are nice where you want to create lifelike vector art, 3D lighting effects. You want your fills, your gradient fills to follow the curves. And you can do this kind of right now, but it's hard. So here's a petal that's got composed of 4 different layers to try to get that 3D effect. Okay. Anyway, there's some requirements for what you need. I won't go through all the different types of, I'm running out of time, of gradients you can have. But we chose to have Coons patch mesh gradients. And these are nice. They're actually fairly easy for content creators to use, at least if you're using like an Inkscape program. They're fairly straightforward to implement. And it's a mature technology. It's already in PostScript, PDF. There are open source libraries that support it, so you can see how to do it. I guess I don't have time to go through the syntax, but just point out, the syntax allows you to do things like, you can take a rectangle and wrap it to form a conical gradient. This just shows you the syntax of how you would do that. Here is an example. I have a patched version of Inkscape. Actually, it's in trunk now, but it's hidden, that implements SVG meshes. And in about an hour, I created the pepper with a buggy version of Inkscape. And I'm sure an expert could probably do it in 5 minutes. So here's one pepper's a photo, and the other one is a mesh gradient drawing. But there is some problem that we have to deal with, and that is what to do with the boundary. In one dimension, a mesh is like a linear gradient, and here is a gradient composed of what would be equivalent to 2 patches. And you notice that the color, as you move across, the amount of color of red, green, and blue is continuous, but it's not smooth. And when you have abrupt changes like that, you get what's known as mock banding. You can see places where the red line bends. You can see it's brighter at that point. That's because your gradient is not smooth there. And in 2 dimensions, or 1 dimension, it's not so bad, but when you start doing things in 2 dimension, it gets quite noticeable. You can try to manipulate things. You can try to smooth things out. And if you smooth things out, then that mock banding goes away. But how can you do that with patches? Here's an example with 4 patches, and you can see the cross. You can have tensor points in your mesh, which are 4 additional points in the center, and as you move those around, you can spread the color differently. You can kind of get rid of the banding, but Not completely. Well, how does Adobe and CorelDRAW deal with this? Well, when you export a single patch from Adobe, you're actually getting 64 patches. 64 PDF patches. So they do it by, well, just by dividing up the patch into individual smaller patches where you don't notice the mock banding. But you can see, if you looked at this carefully, you can actually see some mock banding in there. You can see the structure. Now, it'd be nice to be able to do smoothing like Adobe does, or CorelDRAW. We asked Adobe if they would tell us how they did it, because it'd be nice to be able, just in SVG, to have that smoothing already there. So you don't have to export 64 patches for every patch that you created. But they wouldn't tell us. So I've got some ideas on how to implement auto smoothing in SVG, but I need some time to test them out. But the basic mesh is already in the standard. Now it's a question of, can we find a way of having an option to smooth that mesh? Okay, there are a number of things that probably won't be in SVG2 or be handled by other modules that are probably of interest. One is SVG and OpenType. And Firefox has already implemented this, a demo. It's under a flag, so you have to turn the flag on to see it. But here you have multicolor fonts. And at the risk of, oh, no. I guess it doesn't find that link. I had a link to a demo that someone created. Also, regular shapes and stars are something that people would like to have in. I'm not sure. The resources of the SVG group are limited. It's not just writing the spec, but also being able to write tests, getting people to implement things, and already there's quite a bit of stuff to do. But regular shapes and stars are of interest. Path segments, especially where you have maps, where you have map boundaries, where you share the same boundary between two objects. That would be something that we'd like to have, but it's probably not going to make it into SVG2. Connectors, being able to connect objects together to show the relationship between the objects and have it done automatically. That's something that might be in a separate module. Warp text. We already have text along a path. It'd be nice to be able to have two paths and have the text in between those paths. Also, better define text on the path. Actually, the office, it says office text, is actually something you can do in SVG 1.1, except for you're not going to get what you see there. You're going to get kind of blocks of letters going around. They're not going to wrap around, like, look at the FFI. So hopefully we can better define what you're supposed to do when you have text wrapped around a path. So anyway, in summary, the SVG working group is making quick progress with SVG2, but there's a lot to do and the group is small. And if you see anything that we're not going to put in that you want to put in, you can lobby. And there's a higher chance that it'll make it. Okay, again, I'm sorry about the technical problems at the beginning of the talk, and I appreciate you guys staying around for it. So any questions?
Sure. Can you talk more about the screening feature and the technical implementation of that?
Well, it's basically, you're just looking at what's underneath. What, your bitmap or whatever drawing, and then you decide by the color or the intensity what the probability is for putting a dot there or the size of the dot. You can do either way.
They're referring to.
Okay, SVG's got filters, and a filter effect is made up of primitives. So you have things that, for example, you can shift an image, you can blur an image, you can merge two parts together. Those are all primitives. And they're about, 15 primitives, 13 primitives, something like that. And so if you add another primitive, then that would be part of that chain. Any other questions?
In your SVG text examples, you use attributes like font family and size to style the text. Would it be possible to use CSS3 to style?
Oh, you can already.
Okay.
So
that was just a simplification.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, you can already. The browsers already support CSS.
Right.
And even Inkscape will understand CSS. It won't write out CSS Well, it does. It writes it all into one big style. It won't write into a style sheet.
So when you say talk about CSS and SVG, can you put CSS in an SVG file, or
Yeah, you can put a style section.
a
in
style
SVG.
section on the page? But you can't have like a a whole section that applies to it, or you mean the style modifier on an individual element?
You can do both.
Okay, I knew you could do the one. I didn't know you could do the other.
Yeah. And you can even refer to an external style sheet.
In an SVG file.
Yes. Yes.
Cool.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.